Hello, everybody. You're listening to Alternative Revelations with Linda Emanuel. And this is podcast number 42, Killing Mycoplasma with Bacterial Phage Therapy. And before I get started, I have to read this disclaimer that I am not a doctor, nor am I a medical practitioner. I am just a researcher searching for the truth and passing the truth on to other people. And with that said and done, I can now begin the podcast. And again, this particular protocol is in my book, which is now available on Amazon.com. And I sound like a broken record. And again, bacterial phage therapy just reinforces the fact that all cancer and all disease are infections, most commonly bacteria. And this protocol, which is called phage therapy, and phage is spelled Phage therapy. This was discovered back in the late 1890s, but wasn't fully developed until around the 1920s and 1930s. But before I get started, I still am going to do the podcast about mild silver protein. It is the big one. It is your quick fix. I've been talking to the doctor. We've been getting everything straight on what we're going to talk about. I don't want to mess up. I've always been a guest on radio shows. I've never been the host or the one in charge. So he's right now. We're kind of going back and forth. What he wants to talk about. His expertise is really stem cell therapy, but he also has been given the silver IV and has seen great results. He's a wonderful person. He's a great doctor. I'm really looking forward to you getting to know him. And our interview is going to be on Zoom, and you'll be able to see the live conference call or the podcast on YouTube. But then I'm going to convert it to podcast form, and you won't be able to see the video. But again, it will be posted on the YouTube channel. My YouTube channel is called Alternative Revelations. And you can also find my podcast on my website, www.lindaemanuel.com. So with that said and done, I'm going to begin the podcast, and here goes. And once again, if the medical industry was forced to realize that cancer and disease are most commonly bacterial infections, this type of therapy would be an effective, inexpensive treatment. Now, the following is how bacterial phages were discovered. Now, as far back as records go, there were reports that river water had the ability to cure infectious diseases such as leprosy. And in 1896, a man by the name of Ernest Hanbury Hankin observed a phenomenon. He reported something in the rivers of India that had antibacterial actions against cholera. Then in 1915, a man by the name of Frederick Twort, a bacteriologist, discovered an agent that killed bacteria. He theorized it was either an enzyme or a virus or just a stage in the life cycle of a bacterium. Unfortunately, World War I interrupted this man's research. Then in 1917, a man by the name of Felix de Herelle, that's D''Herelle, of the Louis Pasteur Institute, discovered an invisible and antagonistic microbe, which was a virus parasite of bacteria. He called this virus a bacterial phage, getting it from the Greek translation for phage, Phage, which means eat. He documented a patient being cured of dysentery using bacterial phages. Now, Felix is now known as the researcher who introduced the concept of phage therapy. Now, if you know a little bit of our history in the United States, where in the 1800s and before, people were, the doctors were what they call holistic, using herbs and other ways to heal people of disease and cancer. And cannabis was especially used by doctors before the allopathic takeover of America, where cannabis was banned, because the pharmaceuticals do know the properties, what is in cannabis, that cannabis, the alkaloids in cannabis kill Mycoplasma and other bacteria. Now back to the podcast. And then around the 1920s and 30s, our medical industry was hijacked by the Rockefeller Institute, and they became allopathic, and they went away from the natural treatment of disease, especially cancer. So it's not surprising that bacteriophages were discovered to be antibacterial and were used in the United States and in Georgia, which is by Russia, in the 1920s and 1930s. However, with the introduction of antibiotics by the allopathic medicine industry in the 1950s, the American medical industry lost interest in phage therapy. Now, according to sources, there are 19 families of viruses which attack bacteria. But unfortunately, antibiotics kill both good and bad bacteria. But bacteriophages are very specific, targeting only certain strains of bacteria. And one of the densest places to find phages is in the ocean. Now, this could explain why scientists have found that sharks do not get sick or do not get cancer. This could also be why mammals and fish and other sea creatures do not get cancer or disease. Because again, cancer and disease are infections, and bacteriophages in the ocean protect marine animals and fish. Now, scientists estimate that 70% of bacteria living in the ocean are infected with bacteriophages. I'll repeat that. Scientists estimate that 70% of bacteria living in the ocean are infected with bacteriophages. For the last 90 years, phage therapy has been used as an alternative to antibiotics in Georgia. Now, this is part of the former Soviet Union, not in the United States. And it's also used in Central Europe and in France. Now, communist Russia in the early 20th century has a most interesting tale to tell regarding phage therapy. And it goes as follows. And before I get started, you'll have to excuse me if I mispronounce the names. They're very difficult, and in the Wikipedia, there is no, like in dictionaries, there's no way that they tell you how to pronounce it. So again, I'm going back to the story about how bacteriophages and communist Russia have a connection. Now, Professor George Eliava, that's Eliava, was unaware of bacteriophages until he visited the Louis Pasteur Institute in Paris and met Felix de Herelle. Eliava was so fascinated with the concept of phage therapy that he invited Felix to visit his bacteria lab in Georgia. Now, Felix visited the lab twice in 1933 and 1934. And in 1934, Stalin invited Felix to work at the Bacteriological Institute, and de Herelle accepted. He worked with the Russians for 18 months. Then in 1935, Felix dedicated one of his books on phage therapy to Stalin. Then in 1937, Felix was planning on taking up permanent residence on the grounds of the Institute, but before he moved to Georgia, tragedy struck. George Eliava, who ran the Institute in Georgia, was accused of being an enemy of the people and was put to death by Stalin. This squashed Felix's plans to work at the Institute. Even though Eliava was dead, the Institute of Phage Therapy stayed open. During the days of the Iron Curtain, people from all over Russia came to the Institute for treatment of cancer and disease. And phage therapy had become routine practice throughout Russia for the treatment of bacterial infections. Then in 1991, Georgia refused to become part of the Russian Federation, and war broke out in Georgia. Now, the Institute was destroyed along with its records and bacterial phage samples. Then in 1997, a report was broadcast on the English BBC, which sparked an interest in phage therapy. The Institute took several years to recover thanks to scientists and doctors who flocked to Georgia to aid in salvaging this type of therapy. Now their website is as follows: www.eliava-institute.org www.eliava-institute.org, and I will put the link on the podcast description. Now, I have always talked about how our government is against us. They do not want to get us well, but actually we are corporate controlled. Pharmaceuticals have a big say in what our choices are. Now, the following it infuriated me when I read this article and found this research. And this goes back to August of 2001. An article appeared in the Journal of Microbiology entitled Transduction by BB-1, a bacterial phage, and I'm just going to shorten it to Lyme disease. Co-authored by none other than our own U.S. government. Now I ask, why has a taxpayer-funded government agency, which is the NIH, kept an effective treatment for Lyme disease buried for over 15 years when millions of people worldwide are suffering and dying from Lyme disease? And if you've listened to my Lyme podcast, you know that this was another bioweapon unleashed on us in the 70s and 80s by our own U.S. Army of Fort Detrick. And if you also listen to the podcast, you know that Lyme disease, or the spirochete that causes Lyme disease, is in the same family as the spirochete that causes syphilis. So when you have Lyme disease, you have the same symptoms as syphilis, and it is a horrible death to die of Lyme disease. But one good thought is this, that mild silver protein knocks out Lyme disease like you cannot believe. Now, there's a story about a woman from St. Louis, and I had this straight from the person. She spent $100,000 down in Florida at a Lyme clinic to get well from Lyme disease. She did not get well. Then she came back to St. Louis, and at the time there was a doctor that was given the IV silver. And she just got a couple treatments and was totally well. And this woman was bedridden and close to death. So it's really, really sad that our government is controlled by the corporations. And I'm going to get more into depth about this in podcasts in 2020. This year I'm concentrating on Mycoplasma, but I am working on other avenues of interest, and I will share them with you. But it all ties in with Mycoplasma and freedom and our freedom of choices and a peaceful solution to this madness. Now, I went on the Eliava Institute website, and I have put together some of the following, some phages that they use to treat certain diseases, and they are as follows. Now, I would say that the Eliava Institute has around 100 bacterial phages in their samples, but these are some of the bacteria that they have a defense against our bacterial phages for. One of them is E. coli, which people can die of, and it's usually contracted through food contamination. They also have a bacterial phage for the bacteria that causes anthrax. Also, bacteriophages for bacteria that cause urinary and respiratory tract infections. Another bacteria they have a bacteriophage for causes meningitis. Another one, bacteriophage against the bacteria that causes colitis and sepsis. Now, if you remember back in World War I, most people didn't die of their injury. They died of wound infection, and they had to be amputated. They have the bacteriophages that kill this bacteria that cause wound infections and urinary tract infections. They also have bacteriophages that kill bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics, notably cystic fibrosis and traumatic wounds. Now, this bacteria that I'm talking about affects the immunocompromised people. They also have a bacteriophage that kills salmonella, which causes typhoid fever, and when it invades the bloodstream and spreads throughout the body, invading organs, and secretes endotoxins. Now, this can lead to life-threatening hypovolemic shock and septic shock, and this bacteria infection requires intensive care. Now, they also have bacteriophages against bacteria that cause dysentery, and this was a big killer in the Middle Age time because many soldiers died of dysentery. And people who get dysentery, they are infected through fecal oral contamination. Now, they also have bacteriophages that kill Streptococcus variety of bacteria, which there are 50 species. They cause pink eye, meningitis, bacterial pneumonia, endocarditis, and the flesh-eating bacteria infections. However, many strep species are not pathogenic and form part of the human flora on the mouth, skin, intestine, and upper respiratory tract. Now, also for your information, there are some strep bacteria that are a necessary ingredient in producing Swiss cheese. And I have mentioned in other podcasts and in my book that one of the favorite foods of bacteria is milk products. So I think it is really harmful to ingest milk products, or at least do it in moderation, because this is one of bacteria's favorite foods. Now back to the podcast. And there's many more bacteriophages on their database, and I researched all of them on Wikipedia because I was curious which ones they had. Now, I noticed that they didn't have Mycoplasma listed on their database, but I know there is a bacteriophage for Mycoplasma. It was in a documentary by Ty Bollinger a couple years ago. They mentioned this therapy. So this wraps up this episode 42, all about how to kill mycoplasma with bacterial phages. And hopefully in the future, hopefully in the near future, we will attain freedom. We will attain our medical freedom and have the choice to use bacterial phage therapy. But in the meantime, mild silver protein is available. Other protocols that I've mentioned in these podcasts are available. We still have some medical freedom. And the big thing is to educate yourself, learn how to protect yourself from cancer and disease. It's up to you. The medical industry is not your friend. We do need them to set arms and broken arms and legs and heart transplants, etc. But if the truth ever came out that cancer and disease are infections, this would all come to an end. This madness of people dying from cancer and disease when it doesn't need to be happening. There are effective protocols that kill mycoplasma along with other bacteria, viruses, and fungus. Listen to my podcast, Educate Yourself. And my next podcast, I believe it's going to be on aromatic therapy. That's one more protocol I have in my book. And then I'm getting ready for the big one with Dr. Jim Taylor, who has 3 offices, 2 in Florida and 1 in sunny Cancun. So you don't want to miss this one. This is going to be the big one, the climax of the year 2019, and we're going to start 2020. Every single person who listens to this podcast, they are going to get well if they have cancer or disease. So we're going to end 2019 with a lot of New Year's resolutions to get well from cancer and disease and learn how to protect yourself from cancer and disease. So I hope you learned something from this podcast. I hope you learned something from all my podcasts. That's what it's all about. So until next time, good night and God bless.